Hi, it's Anna. Welcome back to Books on the Go. I'm here with a winter TBR, and these are the books that I wanted to read in June. But it's, what is it now, the 24th of June, and it hasn't happened. So that was a bit too ambitious, but I'm thinking I'll make it a seasonal TBR. So if I can get to them in the next month or two, I'll be happy. And they're mainly books that I've had on my shelf and I've been really wanting to get to, and a couple that I've bought. Because we know that I broke the book buying ban, which is good, but that just adds to the pile. So the first one is The Paying Guests by Sarah Waters, and this is one that Annie recommended, and we're going to do it on the podcast, and I think it came up as part of Pride Month. She's an author I've been meaning to get to, and is, I think, best known for Fingersmith and The Little Stranger. And this one is The Paying Guests, set in 1922, and it's Frances and her mother who have lost their Frances's brothers in the war, and also her father has died, and they live in a large house but they can no longer afford to maintain it, so they have to bring in lodgers, or as one of their friends says, who's too polite to say the word lodgers, the paying guests of the title. And so Mr. and Mrs. Barber, I think it is, move in, and it goes from there. And what happens is that stirs up some desires in Frances, and I think she might embark on a relationship that's sort of an illicit affair or relationship, and the intrigue follows from there. So I'm actually quite close to finishing it now, and I've been quite keen just to knock it off because it's such a big chunky book, and I didn't want this to be sort of weighing me down for weeks and weeks. So I will say more about that in my June wrap up, and we'll have a podcast episode on it in the next couple of weeks. So stay tuned for that one. That's The Paying Guests. And then Irène Némirovsky, All Our Worldly Goods, which I'll be doing on the podcast with Amanda. And Irène Némirovsky is one of my favourite authors. I loved her book Sweet Française. She was writing in the 1920s through to 1942. She was a Ukrainian woman who was then living in Paris, and then had to leave Paris during the German occupation and lived in rural France, and wrote Sweet Française in that time. And tragically, she was taken to Auschwitz in 1942 and killed. So her life was cut short, and the book Sweet Française was discovered only relatively recently, which is what brought that, and I think her work, to wider attention. Well, certainly that's when I heard about it. But in her day, she was extremely famous and quite prolific, and so just an amazing author. And her style is she has that style that she makes it seem effortless, and so it reads beautifully, but of course that takes great craft to do that. And so she's one of those authors that I know that I'll really enjoy the book, and they're all sort of waiting for me, so I buy them one or two at a time, normally when I'm in London, because they're more widely available there. So All Our Worldly Goods is set in the 1930s, I believe, or around that time, and it's a sort of a love affair. Pierre and Agnes are in love, but Pierre is engaged to someone else who's approved by his snobbish mother, and so I think it's a family saga, but she always has really interesting backdrops and settings, and she brings towns to life and places to life, as well as the characters. So I'm looking forward to that, and that is also a good one to do for Women in Translation Month, which is August. So depending when I get to it, it might be an August sort of podcast episode, but we'll see how we go. Normally I miss all of these months and I read books at different times, but it is a good one if you're starting to think about that. And then another one that I'm expecting to really enjoy is Simon the Fiddler by Paulette Jiles. And I think I mentioned this I might have had a book haul or a podcast, sort of what was coming up on the podcast video. I loved The News of the World by Paulette Jiles, and I was really excited to see this one was coming out. I think it's about Simon, who is a fiddler of the title. He's a musician, and it's set just after the Civil War, and during or after the Civil War in America. He's enlisted to the army, the Confederate army, but as part of the band. But he also meets a woman and falls in love, and then has to try to find her maybe after the war has ended. So it's a book that I think at the moment that sort of story doesn't feel particularly urgent or compelling just right now, but knowing her writing and how charming and engaging the news of the world was, I'm confident that she can, draw me in, and that I'll be really enjoying reading this. And I think of it as a sort of comfort read, just because that's how the news of the world was for me. I don't know if it's the same, but just a book that if you just want something to curl up to on a cold winter's night will be really enjoyable. So I'm looking forward to it, and we'll be doing that. I think Amanda is doing that with me on the podcast. And next, there are just so many books I'm dying to get to, and this one again I spoke about on my Pride Month episode, my Pride Month video, and this is Orlando by Virginia Woolf, and I've got this beautiful folio edition with pictures and an introduction by Jeanette Winterson, and I just can't wait to read it. I've read some of Virginia Woolf's other books, but I still have a few to read, and it's been on my shelf. Annie mentioned it on our Pride Month podcast episode because it's one of her favourite books of all time. I think it's a transgender storyline about a young boy who transforms into a woman, or it could be vice versa, I apologise, and I think spans a great number of years from memory, but I really don't know much more, and it doesn't have it just, because I think everyone just assumes with the classics that you know exactly what the story is. They don't give you a blurb or anything like that. Yes, so it's a novel written as if it's a biography, to call a fiction a life, and to invent that life around a woman the author was in love with, and to stretch her over 400 years. So I'm just checking Jeanette Winterson's introduction, and it really makes me want to dive in and read the whole book. But that will happen soon. So this was one I wanted to get to during June for Pride Month. I've still got 6 days, so we'll see. But if not June, it will certainly be in the next month or two. So that's Orlando. And another one that I really wanted to read this month is Guapa by Saleem Haddid. And that's another book that we talked about on the Pride Month episode, set in a Middle Eastern city and based around a character called Raza, who works as an interpreter by day, and by night he goes to Guapa, which is a nightclub where the city's LGBT community meet up, and he has a lover called Tamor, but Tamor's getting married. So then they get discovered by Raza's grandmother, and things come unstuck. And I just had a quick read of it, the first couple of pages, and found the tone really engaging and really wanted to read on. And so I think that feels to me like a book that's current and important, and also a perspective that I haven't read before that really intrigues me. So I will report back on that one as well, but hopefully June, July, I'll be getting to this. And then another one which just arrived this week, Blakwork by Alison Whittaker. And this was another one that Annie mentioned when we did our Pride Month episode. And Alison Whittaker is an Indigenous Australian queer author who writes poetry, among other things. I think she's multi-talented, but this is a book of poetry, and Annie just raved about it and said she's really funny and really on point. So I just ordered it immediately. I think it was from Mazzarella Books. It was Mazzarella Books, which I'm now following on Instagram. And Jacqueline from 6 Minutes for Me has also recommended all of their books. And so I was excited when this arrived. And of course, again, I just wanted to sort of dive into it. And it has a really interesting look. So some of the pages look quite conventional like that, and then others have the words going all over the page. One of them has the words sideways, and some of them are sort of just everywhere. There's this as well. And so it looks quite inventive and fun. And even though I don't read a lot of poetry, this just sounds too good to pass up. So that's Blakwork. Then another one I'm very excited about, Bluebird by Attica, Locke. And I mentioned this as well in a recent video, but I just bought it, in the last few weeks. I've been meaning to read it for ages, but I just hadn't got to it. But Attica Locke, I had heard about her. I think this is the book I had heard about. I know she's written earlier books, but she was interviewed on the Waterstones YouTube channel, and then Simon Savage did a delightful interview with her on Instagram recently. And I think she has the sequel to this coming out now, which is Heaven My Home. And so she's doing some publicity around that. And she's just so delightful. I've fallen in love with her from watching these videos, and I want to read all of her work. She has a great sense of humour, a really warm personality. And this is a crime novel, or I think loosely described as a crime novel, set around Highway 59, which runs up and down America, and it's based on a park ranger who has to solve crimes. There are 2 bodies that turn up in the river, and it goes from there. I don't know much more, but I remember a couple of years ago people raving about this book, and I'm a bit late to it, but I am now, getting to it. So I'm very excited to read that. That's Bluebird. And then another one which arrived recently, Hood Feminism, Notes from the Women White Feminists Forgot, by Mikki, Kendall. And this will be good, I think, to have a non-fiction as well. Can be nice to break up if you're reading lots of novels, because it's hard to sometimes go from one novel to another when there are different styles and different countries and all of that. This can be a good circuit breaker, and it's been described as the feminist intervention we have all been waiting for, by Fatima Bhutto. And Elizabeth Gilbert says, "My wish is that every white woman who calls herself a feminist will read this book." So that would be me. I'm sort of the audience, I guess, for this one. Yeah, so it says in the blurb that mainstream feminism is often not focused on the basic survival for many, but the increasing the privilege for the few, and meeting basic needs is a feminist issue. And that really interests me, and I think that is true. Often feminists, not that they're invalid, but to complain about, did I get my 2% pay rise or whatever, the glass ceiling in my corporate job, when there are, in terms of women's issues, there are much more urgent, pressing issues in other parts of the world that we sometimes forget. So that's one aspect. I don't know if that's what this book is about, but certainly that interests me. So Hood Feminism, I'll let you know how that one goes. And then The White Girl by Toni Birch. So this one I've been so excited about. It's a novel by Toni Birch, who's an Aboriginal Australian author, and I loved his short story collection, Common People. And so I was really excited to see that he had a novel coming out, and Jacqueline at 6 Minutes for Me has already been reading it and raving about it. Annie's very excited, so we might do it on the podcast, but I haven't started it yet. I can't tell you much more, but I think it's Odette is looking after her granddaughter Sissy and trying to prevent Sissy being taken away by the authorities, which is a thing that has happened in Australia historically, authorities intervening and taking Aboriginal children from their families. Of course, it's a very sort of distressing part of our history, the stolen generation, and I'm not sure when this is set, if it's from that time or if it's more contemporary, but I will let you know once I've read it. So that's The White Girl, and it doesn't look immediately like a winter read because you can see the sort of red dirt and hot climate that it looks like in terms of where it's set, but maybe on a really cold day this will be one that I'll feel like reading and going to a warmer part of Australia. And then a winter book by Tove Jansson and translated by... I think because it's a selection of stories, there are a number of translators. Translated from the Swedish by Silvester, Mazzarella, David McDuff and Kingsley, Hart. So Tove Jansson is an author who I love. I loved the Finn Family Moomin Troll growing up, and then I discovered she'd written books for adults, including the Summer book, which I really recommend. That's a novel, but I just love her crisp style. Her writing is really astringent, but there's also a warmth to it, and she writes really interesting characters who are nonconformist and singular, and then she often writes beautifully about nature, and I think she's just wonderful. So I've read some of her other short story collections, but I haven't read this one yet, and I bought it. It must have been about a year ago, and I sort of was saving it for winter because it doesn't seem right to read a winter book in summer, and we had a very hot summer this past sort of year, and so I haven't really had the chance, and now I must get onto it. So that's a winter book by Tove Jansson, and that's quite a stack. I'll show you what this looks like as a sort of a stack. That's what we're looking with, although once I finish the paying guests, that will look a lot better. But it's a little bit ambitious for June, given we've got 6 days. So I'm making it a winter thing. But yes, I'll be interested to know what you're reading, if it's seasonal, which of course might not be winter where you are, or what else you're reading this week or this month. And I will see you soon. Bye for now.